Good evening, and thank you, Dean, for that very kind and generous introduction. And thank you, Clinton School of Public Service, for inviting me here this evening and allowing me to share with you the story of my father, Fred Korematsu. It is an American story. My father was born in Oakland, California in 1919, which is just across the bay from San Francisco. And he grew up as an average American kid, loving to do what other kids do, play baseball and sports. But my grandfather had a flower nursery in East Oakland. Fortunately, my grandfather was able to buy some land before the Alien Land Law took effect in 1913. And he built a flower nursery and the house next to it, and really worked hard on developing a business. And my father was the third son of 4 boys. So in this flower nursery, as in a lot of families, the oldest one kind of tells the rest of them what to do. And he got all the odd jobs like hoeing and painting and doing the things that the oldest one and the second brother, who was really if you will, the spare to the heir, and my father's youngest brother was the baby, so he was doted on the most. And my father went to Castlemont High School in Oakland, and he played sports. He was on a tennis team and golf club and liked to hang out with his friends. And he was an average American kid. He loved hot dogs and hamburgers, and always believed that he was an American. He just happened to be of Japanese ancestry. But he experienced discrimination when he was young. He tried to go and get a real haircut, as he says, at a barber shop in San Leandro, which was a little town next to Oakland. And the barber said, "Get out of here. We don't cut hair of your kind. Go to Chinatown to get your hair cut." And then again, when he tried to go to a diner to be served, they shooed him away and said, "No, we don't serve your kind. You have to go down to Chinatown. You don't belong here." So his experience in racial discrimination came at a young age. And before the World War II broke out, he and his friends thought, well, they're talking about the draft, and they wanted to stay together. So they thought that if they enrolled together in the draft, that it would be a time that they could spend. And so they went to the post office, the local post office, where they have it was a different time then, where they had the tables, and you could go up to the Coast Guard, which they did, their table, and to get an application. But the officer refused to give an application to my father, but he gave the application to his Caucasian friends. And they said, "Well, come on, Fred, let's go down to the National Guard and see what they'll do." And again, the military officer refused to give my father an application because he was of Japanese ancestry. And my father said, "But I'm an American. I want to serve my country." And so he was very disheartened. He was embarrassed and ashamed. And even later on, after the war started, or before the war started, his friend's military officer found out that my father was Japanese and told him not to associate with my father. And so my father was not deterred. He decided to go to the shipyards and became a welder. And he got into the little hulls of the ships, and you know, the riveting kind of ricocheted off the walls with no ear protection. But he really worked hard. And in fact, one day when he was approached by his superintendent, he said, "Well, we want to make you a foreman. Report the next day, and we'll see what we can do." So when he went to punch in his time clock that morning, there was a note there that said to report to the union. And then they said, "You no longer can work here because you're Japanese ancestry." And so by the time that Pearl Harbor occurred on December 7th, 1941, it was a scary time for everyone. My grandparents didn't know what was going to happen to them. And there was certainly, the Japanese Americans were being demonized at that point. And there was a backstory to all of this, the agriculture that was happening up and down the West Coast. The government, U.S. government, had gone into Japan in the early 1900s to recruit Japanese to come to America to work in the fields, in agriculture. And that's how my grandfather came to America, as a lot of the other first-generation Nisei. And so there was talk of how these farmers also were doing so well that they didn't deserve the land. So there was that discrimination going on at the same time. When President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1942, it gave the military the authority to force remove anyone from Japanese ancestry from their homes and be forced into American concentration camps. And unfortunately, they only had about 48 hours to decide what they were going to do with their possessions. Now imagine this. You've got a whole household of things that you've accumulated your whole life, and you have to decide within a short period of time what you're going to do with it. Can you sell it? Can you give it to friends to hold because you don't know if you're coming back? And you can only carry with you in two hands 50 pounds each, and that's it. And you had to include your bedding as well, and your towels, let alone your clothes. So people try to sell it as much as they could in a short period of time and give their possessions to their friends. Now, a lot of these people that they thought were friends didn't think that the Japanese were coming back. So they ended up getting rid of it, or they sold it, or they used it. I mean, there were some kind people, especially out in the fields, in the agriculture of Central Valley, where they would help farm the land that the Japanese first generation had, and kept it going until they came back. But my father had to make a decision. Was he going to go, or was he going to stay? He had an Italian-American girlfriend, which if my 91-year-old mother were here, she would tell you it wasn't her, because she would never abandon my father. And so they talked about going to Nevada. You had a very short window where you could go east, but that didn't work out. I don't think she really wanted to go. And he had some minor plastic surgery that she encouraged him to do, but my grandmother recognized him once she saw him, so that didn't work either. But he felt like he was an American. What is it to be an American? He got a job, he changed his name, and wanted to carry on with his life. His way of saying I am an American was not to go with everyone else. And he tried to carry on the best he could. But on May 30th, 1942, he was arrested in San Leandro. And as the dean indicated, Mr. Bessick from the ACLU came to see him in jail, and because he was looking for a test case, because it was unconstitutional. My father learned about the Constitution in high school, and he thought he had rights. And the problem with the forced removal with this military order was that there was no due process at all. What happened to the 4th and 14th Amendment? There was no trial. There was no hearing. These people were just rounded up because they looked like the enemy. And that's not right. And so my father was willing to take that risk. And it was a risk. But Mr. Bessick said, we'll take it all the way to the Supreme Court if need be. And that's what he did. But the moment my father decided not to go with everyone else, to disobey the military orders, he was vilified. He was vilified by his own community. So when he was sent to the detention center, it was an assembly center, a racetrack called Tan Ferran Racetrack in San Bruno, California. No one wanted anything to do with him. Certainly, he had brought shame to his family. I mean, my grandfather was disgusted. My mother was totally disappointed. And his brothers were disgusted. And so no one wanted anything to do with him because they thought if they associated with my father, some harm might come to them. And so he was alone during this time. And he dug ditches and talked to the other Caucasian people that maybe came in. But he was there also to go with my grandparents and the rest of the Japanese Americans to Topaz, Utah. That was a concentration camp that they ended up in. And when they traveled across the United States, as a lot of people did that came from the West Coast that were in Aurora and Jerome, Arkansas, they came by train. And the shades were pulled down because they didn't want people to see in, and they didn't want you to look out to see where you were going, because you really didn't know where you were going. And they ended up in these desolate areas of the United States where the land was flat, and it was very cold in the wintertime and very hot in the summertime. No such thing as air conditioning. And they would be in barracks where there would be several families in these barracks, and they were only divided by ropes and sheets and blankets, and that was your area. You might get a pot-belly stove in the middle. And the conditions were deplorable. I mean, there was dysentery in these camps. You know, you and basically had to create everything yourself. Teachers had to create their own classrooms. They had to try to get materials sent in and try to carry on with education. And they had to make their own hospitals and dig ditches and do all that work to create their own communities. And they tried to do the right thing and carry on. But my father believed that by the time that his case would get to the Supreme Court, certainly that the Supreme Court would see that it was unconstitutional. But he lost. However, it was a 6-3 decision. And the 3 dissenting decisions are probably the most well-known today. Justice Jackson wrote, "The court for all time has validated the principle of racial discrimination in criminal procedure and of transplanting American citizens. The principle lies about like a loaded weapon, ready for the hand of any authority that can bring forward a plausible claim of an urgent need." And my father couldn't believe it, but he decided to carry on. And towards the end of the war, the government, in their wisdom, didn't know what they were going to do with 120,000 people at the end of the war. So they had community members go in and help people get jobs. You could go east, but you couldn't go west. I mean, I always thought it was interesting when I met some Japanese American people that, like someone like my age was born in Wisconsin or Minnesota, and I thought, wow, how did you get there? But that was because they had gone east, from wherever camp they were in. And in Detroit, Michigan, it's where my father met my mother. My mother was born in South Carolina and had gotten a scholarship to Wayne State University to get her master's in biotechnology and did research at Ford Hospital. And so back then, it was a mixed marriage. It was interesting, they got married in 1946. Now, they couldn't have gotten married in South Carolina because of the anti-discrimination laws there, and also they could not gone back to California. But it was, it was racial discrimination wherever they went. But they came out to California in 1949 and decided to stay, because actually my father really didn't want to come back to California. But my grandmother wasn't well, and so they decided to stay there and raise their family. And so my brother and I were born there. But I did not find out about my father's Supreme Court case until I was a junior in high school. In my social studies class, the teacher had assigned these little paperback books for everyone to read. They were on different subjects. And my friend Maya got up in front of the class. She was a Japanese American, third generation like me, and gave this book report on, the book was called Concentration Camps USA. And then she started talking about the Japanese American internment. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I never had heard that before. What's that about? And then she was talking about someone who had avoided the military orders, and it had resulted in a Supreme Court case called Korematsu versus the United States. Oh, that's my name. And all of a sudden, I had 35 pairs of eyes looking at me. Now, I went to a high school that was basically all white and about a handful of Asian Americans. And I'm raising my shoulders and shrugging them and like, well, I don't know what this is about. Certainly, it couldn't be about my father. It had to be some black sheep of the family. And, you know, the first son, my father's oldest brother, didn't turn out to be such a shining light after all. And I thought it was my grandfather's brother that had been here from Japan but somehow disappeared before Pearl Harbor. Certainly it was one of them. And so I said to my friend Maya at the end of the class, well, what's this about? And she says, well, I thought you knew. And I said, no. She says, well, I think this is about your father. I go, no. Can't be. Somebody would have told me. So I run home and I confront my mother and ask her, and she says, yes, this is about your father, but you'll have to wait until he gets home. Oh, wow. Why didn't anybody tell me before? Well, we were all busy, you know, and we were involved in, you know, you were involved in ballet, and we had Girl Scouts and we had Boy Scouts, and you know, we thought we would tell you someday when you're older, about ready to get into college. I'm 16. How old do I have to be? So when my father came home, it was late, and he had employment discrimination and housing discrimination, so a lot of times he worked late. And so I asked him about this, and he said simply, it happened a long time ago, and what he thought he did was right, and the government was wrong. And it was that simple. And I could see the pain in his eyes. And I just couldn't ask him really too many more questions. I said, well, can you vote? Yes, I can vote. Well, what does it mean to have a federal prison record? Well, I just get on with my life. And until my father's case was reopened in 1983, did I know that he had always been, up until that time, I didn't know that he had always been worried about my brother and I. What would happen to us if somehow Japan did something crazy all over again? Who would protect us? Certainly he couldn't protect us. And that was a very, you know, bad feeling. But also I didn't know that my father had always been looking for someone to reopen his case. So when Professor Peter Irons came to see my father in 1982 and said that he had found evidence in Washington, D.C., along with another researcher, Aiko Herzog Yoshinaga, that proved that there was no military necessity for the Japanese and Japanese Americans to be forced removed from their homes, he asked my father, well, are you willing to reopen his case? And he said, yes. And that was another risk. Now, what had been uncovered also was at the time of my father's 1944 Supreme Court case, there had been government misconduct. The evidence that was presented to the Supreme Court, some of it had been destroyed, some of it had been altered and withheld. Actually, the Justice Department had information from that there was no military necessity, that there was no signs of espionage or spying on the West Coast, and there was no reason for everyone to be forced removed from their homes. So my father said yes, and a group of young attorneys, Japanese Americans mostly, Sansei, which is third generation, my generation, came to help my father and did all this work for pro bono, which means, you know, for free. My father couldn't believe it, but when they came to visit us the first time at my parents' house, they all looked like high school kids. And my father said to Peter Irons, are you sure these people know what they're doing? They look awfully young. But they were the best, And they wanted also, many of them, to do this for their own families who had been incarcerated. And then I learned at that time that I wasn't the only one that hadn't been told about the Japanese American internment, that their families really didn't talk about it. There had been this code of silence amongst the Japanese American community not to discuss this. Their way of showing that they were loyal Americans was just to get on with their lives. And that's why they went into these camps without much protest. The term that was used to reopen my father's case was called petition writ of error coram nobis, which means that an error has been made before the court. And since my father had served out his sentence of 7 years probation, they could reopen this case. And it was certainly a day that was a lot of Japanese Americans will never forget. But at the time that was talk of having my father's case reopened, there was this group of Japanese Americans who did not want my father to do so. There was a campaign at the time for redress, to have the government apologize to the Japanese Americans. And they felt like if my father reopened his case and lost, it would hurt their chances. So again, my father went this alone. My family and I were never even a part of the Japanese American community growing up. He was ostracized. So we certainly had spent some time with my cousins and a few other close friends. But I really didn't know what I was. I mean, I was half Japanese and half Caucasian, but I didn't have any sense of my Japanese roots, really, not until my father's case was reopened. And so in federal court that day in San Francisco, my father's lead counsel, Dale Manami, asked Judge Marilyn Hall Patel if my father could read a statement. And I'd like to read to you just a short part of it. The racetrack that I told you about in Tanforan was awful conditions, and they just had whitewashed these stalls, and basically there was a light bulb at the top, it was drafty, dirt floor, and it was not even suitable for animals. And my father said, "The horse stalls that we stayed in were made for horses, not for human beings. According to the Supreme Court decision regarding my case, being an American citizen was not enough. They say you have to look like one. Otherwise, they say, you can't tell the difference between a loyal and a disloyal American." So that on that day of November 10th, 1983, my father's conviction was overturned. And it really set the precedent for the apology that the Japanese and Japanese Americans got when President Reagan signed the Redress and Reparations Bill in 1988. My father's case really set the precedent for that. And he worked hard. He and my mother, along with another group, went to Washington, D.C. several times to lobby. And they talked to the senators and the congressmen, especially that were of Japanese American descent, Nisei like him. And they went on the floor of the Senate and the Assembly and told their stories. And fortunately, they were able to convey these deplorable conditions and how inhumane all of this was against Americans. And for that reason, and also because my father found his voice, my father's Coram Nobis team encouraged him to speak once his case was overturned. And the first time out, they would say, "Oh, Fred, why don't you just show up to this event? You know, you don't really have to say anything, but they would like to see you." Or, they really want you to go over here and meet some people. but you don't have to say anything. Well, this is kind of the situation where the attorneys lie to the client, because then my father had to speak anyway. But what they did, what the Quorum Nobis team gave him, was the encouragement and his voice. And his voice gained momentum. So he crisscrossed the United States and spoke to organizations like this in schools and whoever would listen to him, because he didn't want anything like this to ever happen again. He didn't want the Japanese American internment to be another experience for another ethnic group of people just because they looked like the enemy. And for that reason, my father received the Presidential Medal of Freedom on January 15th, 1998 from, of course, President Clinton. And I only felt like it was fitting that I read the citation that President Clinton read the day of the ceremony. An American who wanted only to be treated like every other American, Fred Korematsu challenged our nation's conscience, reminding us that we must uphold the rights of our own citizens, even as we fight tyranny in other lands. Defying the 1942 order for the internment of Japanese Americans, he stood strong against anti-Asian prejudice in the United States during World War II. Convicted of violating the order, he waited more than 40 years for justice when a federal court overturned the judgment that the Supreme Court first upheld against him. Fred Korematsu deserves our respect and thanks for his patient pursuit to preserve the civil liberties we hold dear. You know, education is our most powerful weapon against racial discrimination. Prejudice is ignorance. We need to teach each other, our communities, our nation, and the world to appreciate and respect our differences and use that to build a better tomorrow. And that's one reason why I co-founded the Fred Korematsu Institute. And education is certainly our strongest weapon against ignorance. Also, my father felt like public service was also key. I mean, that's why he was involved in the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts, and in the Lions Club, the International Lions Club, where he was president for 2 years. He felt like being an American was a way of giving back, of being supportive. And so now we have Fred Korematsu Day of Civil Liberties in the Constitution for the state of California. That was established in 2010, signed by Governor Schwarzenegger. And we had our first celebration, which is on my father's birthday of January 30th, 2011. But this day is in perpetuity. Unfortunately for California, they don't get the day off because, you know, that would cost money. But it's an opportunity for education from K through 12. And my goal is to establish Fred Korematsu Days in other states as a way of not only talking about my father's story and that of the Japanese American internment, but also to bring relevancy to the issues today that we're still talking about of immigration and national security and racial profiling. And perhaps maybe Arkansas might be the next state. Last year, when I gave a workshop to teachers in the state of Hawaii, I also conveyed my wish. And the teacher went back to her school, and the students wrote a letter to the governor of Hawaii. And so this January 30th, 2013, we are going to celebrate Fred Korematsu Day for the state of Hawaii. And it's the beginning. It's not in perpetuity because governors can only designate one day. But we are now in the process of developing legislation to hopefully make it in perpetuity. And so in my lifetime, that's my goal, so that you have to start at the bottom, right, before you can get to Congress, because as we all know, Congress is a mess. And they have other things that they have to do, so you can't start at the top. But for teachers out there, you can even go to our website, which is www.korematsuinstitute.org, and order teachers' kits, because we've had requests from all over the United States and even have interest from Japan and Hong Kong and even the Middle East. So it's, we're lucky in America. We certainly make mistakes, but the one thing great about America is we have the opportunity to right a wrong. And I also hope that you'll be able to see my father's documentary of civil wrongs and rights, the Fred Korematsu story, that my brother was instrumental in creating. And it won 2 Emmys in 2001 for Best Editing and Best Directing. And I want you to go away here remembering my father's words. When you see something wrong, don't be afraid to speak up. Thank you.
You have a few questions?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Sybil, you have a question. The microphone's coming right to you. Okay, get you next.
Hi, how are you, Ms. Korematsu?
Hello.
Would you speak briefly about Gordon Hirabayashi and Min Yasui, because those gentlemen were also really a part of that triad who were involved.
That's correct. They were part of the Coram Nobis cases that were reopened at the same time as my father's. Gordon Hirabayashi was in Seattle and Min Yasui was in Oregon. And their cases first were about curfew. So they were arrested. Actually, they intentionally wanted to be arrested to protest the military order. Min Yasui's case was heard, but it was only his curfew was overturned. But there was no apology. There was no recognition of the government being of wrongdoing. And before he could actually appeal his case, he passed away. Gordon experienced a little bit of the same type of decision, where the judge decided that they would accept the ruling of the government's wrongdoing, but would not vacate his curfew. So he went to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and then 25 years ago, his case was overturned by Judge Schroeder in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And actually, unfortunately, Gordon Hirabayashi passed away in January, but he also received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Obama posthumously.
Yes, sir, we got a question right here. He's bringing the microphone to you.
Thank you. I just want to hear your thoughts about this. I guess historically, the whole concentration for the United States on a particular group of people is not unprecedented. It has happened in the past too. Do you think the United States have come to a point, has it evolved to a point that there's not a high potentiality for them to somehow isolating another group of people? I guess more so I'm referring to this whole terrorist thing as a great threat on the United States. What do you think about that?
Well, they came close. I mean, actually, after 9/11, the government tried to use my father's case because it's still on the Supreme Court record. My father's conviction was overturned, but the original Supreme Court is still considered good law. So they tried to use it as a reason to round up Arab and Muslim Americans and put them in concentration camps. But I mean, at least now we have many organizations that can speak up, which they did. I mean, like I said, my father and the JACL were the first, but we had other organizations as well. Could this happen again? Yes, I think so. You never know at the times of national stress and who is in office at the time, what's going to happen, or what the circumstances are. I mean, it could happen with China. I mean, people, we've got this situation where, we think that they have too much control of our economy. I mean, you never know where this is going to come from. So, that's why education is important. If we, otherwise we're doomed to make the same mistakes. And if we don't get to our young people especially, then we are likely to run into that situation. So you can never say never.
Terry, you got a question right here.
That was really a very well done presentation. My name is Terry Yamauchi, and Dale Manami is my cousin. His mother
I wanted to meet you.
my mother and his mother were sisters, and ironically, I just learned yesterday that my grandfather on my mother's side was imprisoned or interned here in Arkansas, and I already knew that my grandfather on my father's side was here. Richard and I have talked about this before, but my grandfather on my father's side really did not want me to come to Arkansas when I came here 38 years ago.
Oh my gosh.
So it's a pretty amazing story, but I would put in a plug for President Clinton, because he recognized the injustice of all this, and when he appointed me to a position in the state, he actually sent a personal letter to my father, which made him my father's biggest hero, and he could do nothing wrong. So I would say that President Clinton was instrumental in helping with all this, as well as what the work Dale and his group did. So thank you for coming and visiting with us.
Oh, pleasure. Don't go away
Got
either.
questions right here. Here we go.
May I just speaking of President Clinton, if he can hear this eventually, I'm hoping he's going to help me with a public service announcement for Fred Korematsu Day to be established in other states, and to bring the focus on education. Because, as I said, it's not just, it's an American story, but also it transcends around the world. And, but yes, the fan club for President Clinton was certainly, my father was a big member.
Hi, thank you for coming and talking to us. I'm really honored to hear and listen about your father. I wanted to know what happened, how long were the Japanese American in these concentration camps, and what happened to them after they left?
They were all went in about 1942, and the last camp closed in 1945. So they were in there for a while. As I said, towards the end of the war, the government knew that they were going to win, and hopefully Japan was going to surrender. So that's why they started letting out people that could get jobs. That was the Nisei generation, my father's generation. So my father was 23 when he was arrested. But the Issei generation, like my grandparents, were the last ones to leave, because they didn't know what they were going back to. Now, in some instances, they didn't have anything to go back to, because they burned everything. They burned anything that had any relationship to Japan. And they had to start all over. Many had lost their businesses. So it was very much a struggle for them. I mean, fortunately, the bank had kept my grandfather's nursery, and so when they went back to Oakland, they were able to retain it, but it was in rack and ruin. I mean, all the nurseries were, the glass was broken, it was falling down, it hadn't been painted. The only thing that was, there was a boiler room that was still kind of intact. That's where they cut the flowers. And my grandfather had put the family photographs up in the rafters, hidden. Well, thank goodness he did, because in February of this year, we just dedicated my father's photograph portrait, and the one of my father and his mother and father and his three brothers that were taken in 1940, and dedicated it to the National Portrait Gallery at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., in an exhibition, permanent exhibit called Struggle for Justice. And my father is the first Asian American to be in that exhibition, just like he's the first Asian American to have a statewide day named after him in history.
All right, Anthony, do you have a question right here?
Thank you again. I'm just wondering, how do you teach people to speak up? I am from African descent, and I have tried several times to help bring immigration lawyers to conferences where they encourage us to speak up, especially people who get naturalized. They're so intimidated, even up to now. They don't know how to say, I'm an American, because people tell them, when are you going back? So there are many
Yes.
questions like that. I'm wondering, how do you teach us to speak up?
Well, I tell everyone that you have courage. There's something called courage, and everyone has courage. You just have to reach down inside of you and bring it up and use it, because it's one of your God-given tools. And never to give up, hope. I mean, you just keep at it. And that's what we all have to do, is just to keep telling the stories. Give them examples of stories. I mean, that's why I talk about my father, and my father talked about himself, was to tell the stories. People learn by stories. Find stories that resonate with you, and then you can share those stories. And that will give you the courage that you need and others to need. And here, I mean, I was at the Central High Little Rock Visitor Center this afternoon. Oh my gosh, talk about courage. And to my surprise, I hope all of you have been there, because Nikolai did not tell me that part of the exhibition is a panel about my father as someone who was part of the civil rights movement. So there's stories out there, and that's how you convey the message. Sometimes it's not with facts. Facts kind of go over people's heads, they don't remember, but it's the stories that help demonstrate that, we all need to be treated with respect. And you deserve to be here just as much as anyone else.
I agree with Dr. Yamaguchi. Your presentation was just outstanding. And Karen, we
Thank
are
you.
so glad to have you at the Clinton School and to bring this message. And we were glad that we pulled off a surprise by getting her to Central High School and not knowing that her dad was featured. Let's hear it for Karen Korematsu.